The events of the past week that we have all witnessed have certainly set the stage for our discussion today. Little did we know when we began to plan this particular topic back in October that this would be so timely. The readings from the book by Isabel Wilkerson certainly set the stage for some of our discussion. And it's clear that we have some serious problems in the United States that relate to prejudice, bias, and racism. I'd like to talk about the problem in a generic sense, share some historical things with you, and also provide two other aspects, one being what we can take from psychology to understand better the situation. And secondly, I'd like to present 5 different techniques that are being used in order to address empathy as a means of improving the society that we live in. And I'll ask you and invite you to think about how these might be adapted for older populations when we come to the time for our discussion at the end of today's service. The roots of American bias go deep. We know that slavery began in 1619 with the first importation from Africa into the Jamestown colony. We know that in Massachusetts in 1641, slavery was declared to be legal, and it remained legal until after the Revolutionary War. So this is very close to home and is not necessarily just a north-south situation. We know that the Constitution never even mentions the word equality. Back in the terrible events in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, the columnist George Will made a comment that I think was a very important metaphor. He talked about the fact that now the United States has pricked the boil of racism, pricked the boil of racism. And of course, that metaphor implies that racism was always there. It was under the surface, but it took an event such as that to open it and then, of course, let it spread. And it cannot be put back. And so, in a sense, George Will identified the problem. He did not provide a solution, but I think he accurately identified the situation itself. Peter referred to an incident that happened in my professional life in 1968, in which we worked all night in producing a curriculum for American classrooms on the day that followed the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And it was an all-encompassing event in which we worked through the night to do. But it certainly brought home the importance of education in terms of helping our population to deal with and understand better the racism and prejudice that is part, unfortunately, of this country. We're entering a time of hope, but nothing can really change, I think, without some proactive steps that we might try to embark upon. Let's look at the first slide, Christy. This is a quotation that I think helps us to analyze the situation. Professor Reuven Feuerstein, an Israeli psychologist and author of a program that I help train teachers in critical thinking, said in 2006, thinking and feeling are two sides of the same coin, and the coin is transparent. And of course, what he meant by that was that although there are some acts that we engage in that are purely intellectual, and there are some acts that we engage in that are purely emotional, There are far more instances where our acts and words and deeds are a combination of both thinking and feeling. And our tendency has been to look more often at just the intellectual or thinking side of a particular problem and to neglect the fact that there are emotional dimensions as well. And so we need to turn to psychology and ask ourselves, what is there that can help us? And in the slide you have in front of you are some actual aspects of psychology that I think can be brought to bear on this situation. The theory of mind is a relatively new area of research, and theory of mind refers to that time in a person's life when they begin to understand that their thoughts are not the thoughts of everyone else. That normally happens between the ages of 5 and 7. It is normal for a young child to project her or his thoughts on the rest of the world, but that begins to dawn on them at that particular time. Unfortunately, there are some people who only acquire theory of mind later, and we have to admit that there are some people who have never truly adequately grasped that in their own lives, even though they are adults. So this is something that we need to think about in terms of, can we accelerate the acquisition of theory of mind? A second aspect of psychology is the tendency for human beings to categorize. It's very important to be able to categorize because there are many phenomena that come at us every day in our lives. And if we did not have the natural ability to categorize, we would be sorting things always every day and reinventing wheels. And so categorization is very useful when we're talking about things or even ideas. But it can be a dangerous process when we apply it to people. Categorization as a psychological process means grouping items into labeled groups and assigning a label to that. And so one of the danger points we need to alert ourselves to is when we hear a sentence in reference to people that begins with all X's are Y's. That is an example of overgeneralization or overcategorization. And so we need to think about how we can combat that and say that categorization has its limitations when we're talking about people as opposed to things. And then there's another dimension, metacognition, which is simply means thinking about thinking, is a process by which we then solve a problem. And then instead of going on to the next problem, we stand back and ask ourselves, how did I do that? How could I do it differently next time? What strategy really worked? And of course, the advantage of being able to use metacognition is that when we then encounter the next problem, we can have a plan. I've just finished teaching a graduate course on that subject for the University of Massachusetts. So I suggest that this is something that all of us can easily learn to do, to think about our thinking. And then there are some ideas from the area of moral reasoning and the fact that some psychologists have identified the stages of moral development and that some people seem to be stuck at one particular stage or other. And then the role of actual activities where we promote empathy is still another dimension from psychology that I'll go into shortly. And so bearing these 5 aspects in mind, I think we can take things from these and apply them. Well, let's take a look at what we can do. And these next ideas, and we can go to the next slide, Christy, are related to, in particular, the educational system. And you might say, well, wait a moment, that's fine, but this is a society-wide situation of prejudice and racism. And so working with young people is not enough. That may be true, But if we want to have society-wide change, then we need to certainly involve the educational system. And so, as I describe each of these particular activities, I'm going to suggest that in the back of our minds, we think about the question, how can these be possibly adapted for older populations? And that will be the subject of our discussion that anyone would like to stay for after the message this morning. And so the first of these on an educational context has to do with revising the historical narratives. I've had the good fortune to work with a very innovative social studies teacher who, on a Fulbright fellowship to New Zealand, spent 6 months studying how the New Zealand school curriculum incorporates and integrates the study of Maori traditions with the study of the English settler traditions. And apparently they do a wonderful job of that in a very balanced fashion. And she has brought back those ideas to her curriculum and is working on developing revised narratives. She has an essay that's titled Tall Hats and Headdresses, which is, of course, a reference to the stereotypical portrayal of the 1621 first Thanksgiving, supposedly. And when we study what really happened, we found out that the Wampanoag and the English settlers didn't necessarily assemble in the way that they're often portrayed, and that there were a great many things going on behind the scenes that has been neglected in our stories that we tell to children. So this is being rectified, and it must continue to be. A second technique that has been successfully used both in schools and in universities is the construction of debates around a particular issue. And here's the way it works. On a particular day, the professor or the instructor selects a particular issue and assigns half of the class to adopt a point of view on that debate, and the other half of the class to adopt the opposing point of view. And then they have a preparation period to each select some representatives to be a team, and then a formal debate is held in which the first team argues for the defense of its position and the second team argues for its position. But then something important happens if it's done right, and that is on the next day of the class, the professor switches the assignments, and in this case now assigns the team that had taken one point of view to now have to defend the opposite, and vice versa for the second team. And then a second debate is held, after which there is then a discussion about what did you learn about points of view. And so in this case, in this particular model, the students or the learners of any age have had to look at the same issue from diametrically opposed viewpoints. Very effective technique. The third activity, which is often been used now since 1985 when it was first invented, in middle school classrooms. And in this particular model, half of the class on a particular day is identified, or roughly whatever proportion of people have brown eyes, and they are asked to sit on one side of the classroom, and all those who do not have brown eyes are asked to sit on the other. And then nothing further is said, but for the rest of the day, the teacher picks on someone from the brown-eyed group first in any discussion, lets people from the brown-eyed group go to their recess or lunch hour a few minutes earlier than the non-brown-eyed group, and so on. And at the end of that day, the teacher asks about people's feelings, and there is strong resentment expressed, serious resentment by the non-brown-eyed group about people with brown eyes. The teacher doesn't comment, and then the next day, switches the situation. Now, all the people who do not have brown eyes are given privileges throughout the day, and the brown-eyed people are given less privileges, and it's a very obvious thing that happens throughout the day, after which there is then a discussion about how do you feel about people with brown eyes? How do you feel about people who don't have brown eyes? And of course, the students have become so involved in this that they are expressing a prejudice against people with the opposite eye color from theirs until they see, with the help of the teacher, that this is simply an enactment, a simulation of something that's going on in the society at large, and that actually eye color makes no difference. Very powerful, and something that some of your children may have experienced. A fourth activity is the M&M activity. And this is often done with younger children in the school setting, where different children close their eyes and are fed by a partner a blue M&M, a green M&M, a yellow M&M, a brown M&M, and in each case, they're asked to identify the taste. And of course, the taste is exactly the same. There is no difference in the content of the M&M. It is merely the surface color which is different. And in the hands of a skilled teacher, that also has a big impact. And then the last technique that I wanted to familiarize you with is one that comes from the curriculum on critical thinking that the person Reuben Feuerstein invented. And so I'll ask if we can project slide 4 at this point. And this is an exercise in which there is a series of drawings or cartoon. If we can go to the next one.
1 second, it won't forward for me.
Okay.
We'll get there. Here we go.
Now here we have a situation which is projected and is provided for children between the ages of 3 and 8. And we have on the top a problem situation. We have to define the problem. And of course, it's a boy who is on his way to school and his bicycle is broken and he's worried. And he's worried that he's going to be late for school. And then we have 4 situations, and we have to, through discussion, decide which of these is the irrelevant solution, which of these is an appropriate solution but is missing some condition, which of these is perhaps appropriate but does not have the right intensity, and which one is the most appropriate. And so we go to frame number 4, and we see that a friend has come along and has completely ignored the situation because this friend with the red cap doesn't want to be late for school either. And then we look at frame number 2, and we see that a helper has come along, a friend, who is trying to repair the bicycle, but you can see that this is an ineffective strategy because the person with the broken bike is still forlorn. And then we look at frame number 3, where we see that the friend has come along and is consoling the victim, if you will, and trying to make him feel better. But of course, we can see by his expression that nothing has been solved also. And finally, we have frame 1, where the friend has come along. The bicycle is still broken, but the friend has come along and seen the problem through the eyes of the person who had the problem. And in this case, both boys will make it to school on time. And so these are all some examples of education-based activities which something that is beginning to be done and we need to do much more of. So let's take a look at what we've done and stand back from this to a certain degree. We've looked at the idea of thinking about thinking, becoming aware of our thoughts, and remembering that thoughts lead to actions, trying to see the world through another person's eyes, watching out for over-categorization or over-generalization, all of which are tools in our hands. What we have in our world at the moment, and very obviously so, is a significant number of people who are denying what we would call facts. And I appreciated that Peter, in his opening remarks, pointed out that particular discrepancy. Sociological research has found that when a person embraces ideas that are not true, simply providing them with more facts does not alleviate the situation. In fact, it only hardens the situation. And so what to do about that? And an alternative is we need to understand that empathy is a two-way street. Why would some people embrace things that are not true? We need to ask ourselves also then, what unmet need is there for individuals who have embraced lack of truth that needs to be met? And how can people who have understood the truth help those others to understand, not through giving more facts, but in some way, in an empathic way, providing for some of their unmet needs, which the society, for some reason, has denied them. And so that is perhaps an adult application of the whole idea of empathy. I think Martha's Vineyard is an ideal environment for applying some of these ideas in a particular way. The advantage of Martha's Vineyard, of course, is that it is a community unto itself as an island. It is also one in which there is clear exchange of ideas. And we know that Martha's Vineyard has a history of successful integration of deaf people, much more so than in any other place in the country, because of the fact that there was a high population of deaf people on the island, and is held up as a model for the rest of the country and really for the rest of the world in terms of access. Perhaps once again, Martha's Vineyard can be a model for others to follow. And so I would say at this point that we have work to do, work for parents to do, politicians, spiritual leaders, communities in general, and of course, teachers. And so to close, I would like to use a quotation that I shared with you at a previous time, but I think it is more relevant than ever to what we've been discussing today. And this is the quotation from Edward Markham that means a great deal. If we could go back to the slide that is, there we go. He drew a circle which shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the will to win. We drew a circle which took him in.